Okay, so what we're working on next, as far as the subject matter and the formal qualities of the actual picture making is concerned, is typologies, sequences, and series. I'm going to talk about each one of those individually as the photographers that I'm sharing come up. But first off, we're going to start with typology. Um, and I'm also going to be starting with someone who kind of blends them all together, typologies, sequences, and series. And this is Edward Muybridge. Now, his name used to be Edward Muybridge, but he hit his head really hard and decided that Edward was a better name for himself. He was born in England way, 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 way back in the day, and we have him to thank for creating the very first motion picture ever. So the images that I'm showing were done in the late 1800s, mid to late 1800s, in Palo Alto, actually. He did this work at Stanford. He was commissioned by Leland Stanford, actually. It was more like a bet. They call it a bet. They said, we don't believe that horses, when they run, all of their feet come off the ground at the same time. There was two different camps. One believed it was one way and one believed it was another. And they'd been depicted a specific way by painters and illustrators for hundreds and hundreds of years, how horses actually ran. And what Edward Muybridge did was he set up this long track with a whole bunch of cameras, and they were all set to a tripwire to fire the shutter. So imagine, let's see, in this image there's 12, so 12 cameras were used to make this sequence. And 12 cameras are lined up with a backdrop that would help the horse and the rider stand out. And the rider and the horse rode past, triggering every one of those cameras to take individual pictures, which then could be lined up in a row and seen as a sequence. And as you can see in frame 2 and 3, the horses, and 4 actually, all of the horse's legs do come off the ground. So that was difficult for a lot of historians and painters to actually take in, because they had this understanding and this idea that, that horses ran in a very specific way, but the camera showed something that their eye couldn't. And so what Edward Muybridge did was really kind of transcend what was possible with depicting, ideas in the world. And he then also he was able to turn this into a moving picture by using the tools of the time, which was essentially a cylindrical spinning mechanism that had a light on the inside that when you watched it spin, it looked like the horse was running. Cool. So the very first video of a horse running was the first video ever made. And that was made in California, in Palo Alto, and it was shown at what was called the San Francisco School of Fine Arts, now called the San Francisco Art Institute in San Francisco. So I wanted to bring that up because there's a lot of local history that is, that changed everything about how we see the world today. This is where it started. So he did a few things. They're kind of studies, as you can see. Everything, I'll go back real quick. We've got the bird flying. We've got the horse running. We've got a farmer with a pickaxe just doing the motions and the movement. And nobody had ever seen anything like this before. So what I'm showing you here is, again, like I said, this is kind of the oddball with what my 3 different categories that I'm talking about are. It has the framework of a typology where you see this grid of images, but it's super drenched in sequence. As you can see, it's all about the movement, and if this was out of order, the sequence would be totally screwed up. And then it's also, as a whole, between all of the images, a series. So there's a series of these different projects or these different studies that were all meant to be a part of the same series of movement and of science and learning. So now I'm going to move on to a couple of people that were very, very much specifically typology. Of course, we can look at all of their bodies of work and point them towards, this is a series of steel mills or a series of water towers, a series of siphons. But what Bern and Hilla Becker did, and these were a German couple, they were married and they photographed together, they were a team. Really lovely interviews, listening to them talk about their process. They were beyond scientific with how they did this. They would sometimes wait around for an entire day for the sky to change so that they would end up with a result image that all shared that common backdrop, right? So you can see that all of these images are of this, the towers themselves provide the same function and service, but they're all slightly different because they're different towers. But they do all share the same perspective. You know, it was ritualistic how they brought their images to the same point, at the same vantage point, and they really tried to have this monotony and structure in their work. These ones are really neat. I really like looking at these ones. So it's when you see their work, they're really lovely prints to see because they were just really well made, and they show them like this. You'll see a giant frame that's like 5 foot tall or 4 feet tall, or they're massive, and they have all of these different images that are shared, that are sharing the same frame because they're all in the same typology. I've seen this one in person. It's real neat. It's really cool to see these, and they're massive and they're really, really luscious. So this is one way of making photographs, right? By just sort of scientifically looking at a specific theme. Like you could choose anything from trees to shoes to buildings to cars, and you could do them, if you do them in the same way and you share them in this and you present them in this format, it can really enhance and dramatize the repetition and the subtle differences between what it is that you're photographing. This one's neat because they actually do look quite different, but they were the same tool, they provided the same function, they were just different. Certain type of architecture that you'd find, you know, Dutch architecture or German. So this is Bernd and Hilla Becker. They were making photographs until quite recently. He passed away, I think, about 15 years ago, and she passed away just a few years ago. Really neat work. So we're going to move into series now, and I'm going to talk about, I'm going to use Ed Ruscha as my first example. Ed Ruscha was an LA artist. He's still alive. But he sort of looked at photographing he would pick a subject and then photograph it habitually. And he wouldn't always show it like this. This is probably looking to you kind of like how the typologies looked, where it's just a bunch of the same thing, a bunch of gas stations in this case, on a grid like the typologies. But he didn't always share them like this. You could get a book, which I'm about to show some of his books in a second. But the point of this wasn't to show them necessarily as a grid, rather just to photograph the gas stations themselves and show how they are changing, how they're deteriorating, how they, again, kind of like what Byrne and Hillebecker were doing, the gas stations all provide the same service, but they're drastically different formally and as far as contemporary goes as well. More gas stations. This was a really neat project. He took his truck and he set up a camera in the back of it and drove and photographed every building on the Sunset Strip. Guess what the project was called? Every building on the Sunset Strip. It was built as an accordion book, which, if you haven't seen an accordion book in person, they're really cool. They're meant to be opened and expanded just like they are in this image so that you can actually lay them out on a long table or the floor. I've seen Ed Ruscha's books opened up. They're really cool. It's like you get to walk and see, it's just like walking on, it's just like being in the car, driving along and looking outside the window and seeing everything in its entirety for the entire city street. Here's a close-up. I like the little moments where the frames don't quite line up, like the back of that bug kind of overlapping with the motorcycle image. John Baldessari is a photographer. Well, no, I'm not going to call him a photographer. I'm going to call him an artist. John Baldessari was one of the many in our art history who has turned his back on norms and traditional ways of making and thinking and adapted really kind of silly approaches to a lot of his work that he made. In this project, he basically took found photographs and put colorful dots on the people's faces. And to quote him, he said, "It really leveled the playing field." I think these are really quite funny, and it's also silly. It's you can look at it. You can look at it now and think, what's the point? And why do we need to look at this? And how important is this? And what a lot of us know now is to create something new. Now is really it can be kind of difficult, right? So much has been done, but there's always something new that can be done. And when John Baldessari took these found images and he put these dots on the faces, nobody had seen this before, and it confused people and it made them think, what does it mean to appropriate other people's work? What does it mean to obscure it? Where's the artist's hand lie in this actual process of making? Cindy Sherman is a photographer who has been making work for probably over 40 years now, I think. And she has used herself as the actor. I'm gonna call her an actor right now in every single one of her pictures. When I first heard about Cindy Sherman, I thought that these were self-portraits. But when you look at more of her work, you start to realize she's assuming a new identity. This is her very first project that she made, which is actually my favorite of all the work that she's done, because these are untitled. The body of work is called Untitled Film Stills, and she recreated moments from famous movies. It's pretty incredible to go through these and actually see how different she's able to make herself look by assuming these different characters, using makeup, changing what she's wearing, and changing the scene. Cindy Sherman is quite famous these days. She's continued to make these portraits using herself for all the way, and she still does through today. You can tell it's not necessarily about the person. It's the scene. She's creating this environment and she's acting in it.